She's an author, the recipient of a multitude of international awards, and a former U.S. vice presidential candidate. We talked to renowned environmentalist and Indigenous rights activist Winona LaDuke. But first, it's led to the largest protest Poland has seen in decades. We discussed the country's controversial move to all but ban abortion. For more than a month, Poland has been swept by the biggest protests the country has seen since the fall of communism. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators rallied in more than 500 cities and towns after Poland's Constitutional Tribunal effectively outlawed abortion. Many are directing their anger towards the governing right-wing Law and Justice Party. But will the protesters' demands be able to prevail in this traditionally Catholic country? And is Poland on the brink of a revolution? Joining me to debate this are Karolina, Wigura, political editor of the Polish weekly Kultura Liberalna and assistant professor at the University of Warsaw, and Paweł Jabłoński, deputy foreign minister and member of the Law and Justice Party. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Paweł, I want to start with you. It's been about a month now since Poland's Constitutional Tribunal issued a ruling which would effectively ban abortion. Once implemented, it would prohibit abortion even in cases where there is a fetal defect. Why make this move now?
This decision doesn't effectively ban all abortion because the law provides allows for abortion in case of threats for life or health of a mother, or also in case of rape or incest. What effectively changed here is that the Constitutional Tribunal ruled in accordance with its previous ruling issued on in the last 20 years, that fetal defects that are not fatal, for example, Down syndrome or other non-lethal syndromes, should not constitute a permission for abortion. So this is based on protection of life of people with disabilities. That's more or less the legal reasoning behind this.
Why now?
That is the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal. It's the court that decides the legality of law, the validity and conformity of laws with the Constitution.
Karolina, why do you think this is happening now? And just to be clear, the status quo is that abortion is allowed in cases where the mother's health is at risk, rape or incest, and in cases where there's a fetal defect. Why do you think this is happening now?
Of course, Paweł Jabłoński is right when he says it's not a complete ban on abortion, because there are two other cases in which abortion is still legal in Poland. But you have to remember that according to the data, annually from 1997, only 1,000 legal abortions have been performed in our country, and a vast majority of those abortions was actually due to the severe defect or malformation of the fetus. And this third case is now illegal. So it's a practical complete ban on abortion, because if you're talking about these 2% or something, of course, they are still legal, but it's very marginal. So I do believe the scope of protests came as a surprise for the Law and Justice Party. But I do believe that there was an actual motivation. Namely, the situation with the pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic in Poland, is looking quite serious.
You're saying as a distraction? Is that what you're saying?
You know, when you look at the illiberal populist governments all around the world reach for religion when they want to basically steer emotions, make people choose sides very hastily. You have other examples, like, for example, Recep Erdogan resacralizing Hagia Sophia right now. Mm-hmm. Why now, you can ask. Yes, Donald Trump posing two photos with the Bible. Again, why in a certain moment? So what I'm saying is this is using religion in order to diverge attention from something else.
Okay, so let me put that to Paweł. So Karolina is saying basically you're igniting a cultural issue, maybe to distract from other things. So I want your response to that. And I'm also curious, what is your reaction to how much pushback you're getting, and why are you doing it?
So I heard these conspiracy theories, and there are actually very different conspiracy theories on the reasoning, on the particular moment of that. One theory says that this was a planned distraction from the pandemic. Another one says that that we were suddenly surprised somehow, so this couldn't have been planned. One says that the Constitutional Court acts at the political will of the ruling party. The other says that the Constitutional Court acts in contradiction. Well, all of them cannot be true at once, that's for sure.
Or
and
I
frankly don't believe any of those, because if we look at the jurisprudence of the court again, and I urge and this has been a very interesting phenomenon over the course of these last couple of weeks, that this has been attacked from many angles, but the legal angle that is enshrined in the Constitution, that there is a right to life and there is no limitation of right to life, also that also covers a fetal period of human life, is legally protected.
So I want to ask you about the Constitutional Tribunal. Some could say it is actually a puppet for your party. It has denied opposition-appointed judges the right to take the seats in the court. Earlier this year, the president signed a law forbidding judges from even criticizing government's changes to the judiciary around the same time that a number of retired judges of the Constitutional Tribunal declared that it had virtually been abolished. So you keep saying that this is coming from the judiciary, but how can you expect people to have any faith in the integrity of the judiciary with all those things I just said?
I hear, and we keep hearing these arguments, of course, for the last 5 years. Actually, the week our government took over 5 years ago, there already were first claims of illegality, of lack of legitimization of this government, of these elections. And when we hear the statements that never after democratic transition we had such degree of political control of one party, this is completely false. This is entirely false. If anyone just knows basics of Poland's newest history, and I'm perfectly sure that Karolina knows it, and up until 2015, there was a liberal party in government with president, with all the media supporting it, not just public media, but also private media. And there was absolute full control also over the courts. In the Constitutional Court, there was a full majority, I think 13 or 14 judges at that time were appointed.
So, Paweł, are you saying that this is just how politics is in Poland?
This is just liberal propaganda against us, because they simply were never able to accept the results of democratic elections.
Okay, so what about that? Karolina, Paweł is saying this is politics, this is the way it is. Other parties have done it, other people have done it. What do you say to that?
So if I'm using arguments here and all the time or every time I say something, I hear that I use conspiratorial theories or liberal propaganda, apologies, but it is impossible to have a dialogue this way. Now, I'm not saying that democracy before 2015 has not been flawed in Poland. In fact, I'm one of those persons, and you know it very well, I believe, that have numerously said that some of the deeds of the law and justice regarding the rule of law are on a bigger scope, on a bigger scale, flaws that have been present before 2015.
And in fact, but Karolina, if I want to just get in here because I want you to speak to this as well as you're talking about this. People knew what the Law and Justice Party were about. They knew this. They had an opportunity to not vote for them, and they did.
Do you mean in 2015 or 2019? Because before 2015, Law and Justice didn't run with the slogan of "we are going to change the whole Polish judiciary." Well, they didn't.
You might say
people know. People
that
know
is the main element of our mandate.
People know the position of the Law and Justice Party on abortion.
Yes, of course. I do believe that people, when one read the program very carefully of Law and Justice, then people would perhaps understand that the aim of the Law and Justice is to reform the judiciary, for example. But the medicine that is being used for reforming, for changing the judiciary, the education system, etc., is simply not working, because the only strategy of performing those reforms is simply changing the people, and this is nothing this has nothing to do with reforming institutions.
Paweł, I want to put something to you about these protests. The Deputy Prime Minister, Jarosław Kaczynski, said this about the demonstrations that have been happening, that the demonstrators are committing a serious crime. He called these clashes with protesters a war, despite the fact that they have been largely...
No, it wasn't him.
It wasn't him?
No, it's actually the cry for the protesters. This is war. Or also, excuse my French, get the out. That's the open language they have been using from the very beginning.
So I'm going to finish.
I'm going to finish. And now we hear some anger for reaction.
The quote from the Deputy Prime Minister is, he called the ongoing clashes a war, despite the fact that they have been largely peaceful. He has called for conservatives to defend Poland, and he's basically accused the protesters of committing serious crimes. That is a very odd way to talk about the right of protesters in a democracy, is it not?
So when we hear from the very first day that we should, as I said, get out in a much, much harder language, when we see police being attacked, when we see churches being attacked, and when the protesters are actually crying, this is war, and much
there has been tear gas
words
used on protesters.
So when we hear the reaction to it was most of all people that were protecting churches from being devastated, and this was a natural reaction.
This is a very common tactic, though, is to single out a few isolated incidents when there are thousands of people protesting peacefully. That's a common thing to do, and it doesn't really characterize what the protests have actually been.
It's being said by the leaders of this protest. They incentivize people to act violently. They incentivize people to attack police.
Okay, so hold on.
It's not isolated. This is the nature of this protest.
I want Karolina to comment on this, on these protests. There have been significant numbers of women in these protests, Karolina, leading these protests against their governments, but not just about abortion, but for greater human rights. This is happening in a lot of countries around the world over the past few years: Belarus, Turkey, Thailand, Sudan, Nigeria, even in the U.S. How would you characterize what it is you're seeing with women being on the forefront of so many of these protests and these issues?
Well, you have to firstly understand that those protests have been changing with time. So it is true that at the very beginning, the protests were very much filled with rage, and yes, vulgar words were there. And I do believe that those were vulgar
stones
words.
And bottles, fireworks thrown at the police, and so on.
I didn't interrupt you, Paweł. Those words were there, and people were extremely furious. I would like to underline people, because we all say that these are women protesting, but in fact, those are men and women. Many young people have joined the protests, and the protests became something much more wide as for their subjects. So this has become a whole movement of protest against the law and justice government. But if I asked you, Paweł, if there is the March of Independence every year in Warsaw, and some people are going peacefully, and some people are throwing stones and saying vulgar words, should I then think that all patriots in Poland are nationalists and fascists? You surely would say no, because there are some groups that are doing this, but you surely do not think it's acceptable. So I do believe that the protests have been changing. I think it's extremely important to grasp that this is a new generation that has been using, of course, some vulgar words, but also Immanuel Kant was mentioned, also some other philosophical names. And I do believe it's extremely important because as far as I heard comments from Jarosław Kaczyński and also other politicians of law and justice, I do believe that their definition of politics is from the 1990s, and they do not understand this new generation that has been raised in a free and independent country.
Well, they sure have the world's attention right now. Absolutely. That will have to be the final word. Karolina, Wigura, Paweł, Jabłoński, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. As climate disasters continue to ravage the earth, Indigenous people have been standing on the front lines of the climate crisis, suffering from the most devastating impacts of climate change. From Honduras to India, they've been leading the fight against environmental destruction. But will leaders heed their call? Joining me to discuss this is Indigenous rights activist and economist Winona LaDuke. She's a member of the Anishinaabe Nation and lives on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. LaDuke has been a two-time U.S. Green Party vice presidential candidate and is executive director of the group Honor the Earth. Her forthcoming book is titled To Be a Water Protector and will be released this December. Winona, thank you for joining me on UpFront. So, according to an environmental NGO, Global Witness, 2019 was a terrible year for environmental activists around the world. Apparently, that was a record year of the number of them that were killed. A third of those fatal attacks targeted specifically Indigenous people who make up less than 5% of the world's population. Can you explain why so many Indigenous activists are being targeted and killed?
Because we live in the places where the wild things are. We live in the places where they want to put dam projects, mining projects, and big pipeline projects. The remaining biodiversity is in our territories, and we are on the front lines to protect those because we have no place else to go. That is our life. That is our land. That's where we come from. And so we are targeted because we are out of sight and out of mind. And for, frankly, hundreds of years, they've been killing Indigenous people, but the rate has increased dramatically in the last couple of years with these big mining projects and big pipeline projects.
Okay, let's talk about Indigenous women specifically. In the U.S., Indigenous women are murdered at rates more than 10 times higher than the U.S. average. In Canada, they are 12 times more likely to go missing or killed than any women in the country. Why is that?
Long history of colonialism, long history of taking Indigenous people and Indigenous women, killing us and taking us for granted. And you know, we are certainly have been victims of these perpetrators for all of these years. We live in isolated areas, and then they bring in these big mining projects and pipeline projects and man camps. And that's where the elevated rates of violence and rape occur, is as a result of the fossil fuels industry and the mining companies. You just take the case in North Dakota, where they brought in all of these fracking companies and all of these frackers, and you saw a huge rate increase in violence and in death and violent crimes and in rape. And so there was a very clear connection in North Dakota with the fracking industry and the oil industry and Indigenous people and violence against women. And so what we know is that that's what happens. You bring in all these guys into our communities, and you know, they go after us.
Let's talk more about the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and how it does often go hand in hand with the exploitation of the earth. We saw with the Dakota Access Pipeline in the U.S. back in 2016, right? So there were protesters, sustained protests at this pipeline at Standing Rock, met with extraordinary police violence. Hundreds of people were injured. In fact, there was actually a private company that was hired by the pipeline company to suppress the protests. There were counterterrorism tactics used, and there were people that compared the water protectors to, quote, jihadists. Are you worried about the types of military techniques that are used to suppress what is protected civilian dissent at home?
You know, in the case of Minnesota, Line 3 pipeline was just approved, and part of the agreement in approving Line 3 was that Enbridge would pay for the police. And so what we have now is a Canadian multinational corporation who is handing off assistance in the form of actual physical pieces of equipment to the police in Minnesota. We've seen the influx of an MRAP in northern Minnesota. That's a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier. We are deeply concerned, after having been veterans of Standing Rock, of the $38 million of military repression we expect to be unleashed to benefit Enbridge in northern Minnesota against thousands of people who have opposed this pipeline. 70,000 people have opposed Enbridge's pipeline, and many of us are women and children. And we are expecting a full-on assault of military equipment onto our people.
Let's talk more about Enbridge, this Line 3, as it's called. It is in the state of Minnesota where you live. And for viewers that don't know what we're talking about, this is a nearly 2,000-kilometer crude oil pipeline that's going to link Canada to the United States. As you said, it has been met with strong resistance from people in the area who do not want this project. They say it's going to contaminate drinking water and the environment, all on Indigenous territory. Tell us more about what your concerns are about how it will affect your community. And are you hopeful that maybe some of these permits that have already been approved can be pulled?
This makes no sense to approve a tar sands pipeline in the middle of a pandemic and in the middle of a time when the world is burning. I mean, the fact is that this pipeline is the equivalent of adding 50 new coal-fired power plants in a time when the entire West Coast has been on fire and climate change-related disasters are devastating our world. This should not happen.
So when you talk about the fact that this is happening in the middle of a pandemic, there are people who support labor, unionists rather, who would say this actually is the best time because the pandemic is having such a bad effect on the economy. In particular, the Teamsters Union and the Laborers International Union, very powerful unions, have been very vocal about supporting this project. So what do you say to people who say that projects like this create jobs in communities? In particular, Enbridge has said that this will create about 6,500 jobs. What do you say to people who want these jobs, who need these jobs?
First, 4,200 workers are being imported to Minnesota. Those aren't jobs for Minnesotans. Second of all, the long-term implications of this pipeline are 23 jobs. I have more people working with me than Enbridge will have at the end of this pipeline. This is not a long-term job creation. Third, these are not jobs that you want because they're going to destroy our communities and they're going to destroy our groundwater. And what we really need is the Green New Deal. What we really need is jobs for long-term sustainability for these poor communities that have been ransacked. The mining and the Iron Range is over. The oil pipeline era is over.
You have talked about a Green New Deal before, and in 2018, you actually called for an Indigenous-led Green New Deal, and you also endorsed Joe Biden for president. Joe Biden, though, has explicitly stated he does not support a Green New Deal, that he would not place a ban on fracking. So what needs to happen to achieve a Green New Deal? This seems like it is going to be an uphill battle.
Well, first, we need a little more enlightenment by politicians. I mean, what we need is solutions and not more problems. And what we need within that is to build some kind of society of justice, and that is what the Green New Deal is. In the meantime, you have tribes and communities across this country making the Green New Deal. I mean, the Red Lake Reservation just added 200 kilowatts of solar. My tribe has added 200 kilowatts of solar. You know, the food systems are being transformed into local food systems, and that's all part of the Green New Deal. That's not the legislative part, but in Washington and in Ottawa, they need to make infrastructure for people, not for oil companies. They need to protect us from the ravages of climate change and improve and protect our health, not jeopardize it. You know, this is an opportunity. I like what Arundhati Roy has always referred to as pandemic as portal, pandemic as portal. Never, you know, pandemics force us to change who we are. This one is no different. And in this moment, we have a chance to change this world because we are already changing. And as we look ahead, let us be the people that make renewable energy. Let us be the people that, you know, make local foods. Let's make a real just transition.
So you're talking about a shift. You're saying that the politicians need to shift from a fossil fuel economy to a sustainable economy. But I mean, let's talk numbers. Often what you will hear, the American Petroleum Institute claims that oil and natural gas contribute to 8% of the U.S. GDP. There's a lot of money, is what I'm trying to say, in the oil and gas industry. So is it about a shift in the way people think of capitalism?
Well, you know, first of all, Exxon's no longer in the top 10 of the Fortune 500. It's all tech companies. The oil companies have fallen out of favor in the international world, and they're not the future. The future is in this just transition. The future is in renewables, and the future is in, you know, technology and food systems. So, you know, they could talk about how much money they have, but their money is declining. Minus $38 a barrel of oil is nothing. They taught us in economics class, right? And so the writing is on the wall, and what we need is politicians to see and be visionary and courageous, not to be taking dictates from multinational oil companies. I mean, you know, people are laughing at the United States and saying, who's a banana republic now? You know, I feel like if you're a banana republic, if some multinational corporations tell you what to do.
You know, I want to go back to something that you said that's been stuck with me. When you talk about how Indigenous people are on the front lines, we talked about some of the military tactics that are being used. Are you ever just afraid?
You know, I'm concerned. I pray as hard as I can, and I take my own security measures as I can. But yes, you know, I live in an area we call the Deep North in northern Minnesota. You know, and Enbridge has added and had gas to a fire, as has the governor. You know, what we need is a demilitarization. What we need is peace and not war. And yes, I am concerned about my own personal safety and the safety of many, many Indigenous women and other women who are fighting this pipeline. but we intend to stand strong and courageous because our time is now and their time is over.
Winona LaDuke, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We appreciate it.
Miigwech, thank you.
And that is our show. Up Front, we'll be back next week.